The book of Daniel. The story is set right after Babylon's first attack on Jerusalem, and they had plundered the city and its temple and taken a wave of Israelites into exile. Among them were 4 men from the royal family of David: Daniel, who's later named Belteshazzar, and his 3 friends who you probably know by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This book tells of their struggles to maintain hope in the land of their conquerors. The book's design seems pretty simple at first. Chapters 1 through 6 contain stories about Daniel and his friends in Babylon, while chapters 7 through 12 contain the visions of Daniel about the future. But this 2-part shape is made even more interesting by another design feature, and that's the book's language. It begins in Hebrew, the language of the Israelites, but chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic, a cousin language to Hebrew spoken widely among the ancient empires. But then in chapters 8 through 12, it goes back to Hebrew. This design shows how chapters 2 through 7 are a coherent section, but it also highlights the importance of chapters 2 and 7 for understanding the later chapters of the book. Let's just dive in. Chapter 1 introduces the basic tension of the first half of the book. Daniel and his friends, they're really wise and capable, and they're recruited to serve in the royal palace of Babylon. But they're pressured to give up their Jewish identity by living and eating like Babylonians and violating the Jewish food laws found in the Torah. So they refuse, and they choose faithfulness to the Torah, and it puts them in danger. But God delivers them, and they end up being elevated by the king of Babylon. After this begins the Aramaic section, which you'll see has this really cool symmetrical design. So first, the king of Babylon has a dream that, it turns out, only Daniel is able to interpret. It's about a huge statue made of 4 types of metal, and it symbolizes a sequence of kingdoms, and the head is Babylon. But then a huge rock comes flying in, and it shatters the statue, and it becomes this huge mountain. Now, this dream is the first of many symbolic visions in the book, and this one introduces the basic storyline of them all. Daniel says that the statue represents a train of human kingdoms following from Babylon, and they will all fill God's world with violence. But one day, God's kingdom will come and will confront and humble the arrogant kingdoms of this world and fill the world with the healing justice of God's reign and rule. After this, chapter 3 tells the famous story of Daniel's 3 friends who refuse to bow down and worship a huge idol statue, which, like the statue in chapter 2, represents the king and his imperial power. And so the friends are persecuted. They're thrown into a fiery furnace, but God delivers them from death, and they're exalted by the king, who now acknowledges their God as the true one. After this come a pair of stories about 2 Babylonian kings, the father, Nebuchadnezzar, and then his son, Belshazzar. They're both filled with pride because of their imperial power, and so, like in chapter 2, God warns them both through dreams and then visions, which, also like chapter 2, only Daniel can interpret. He says that both kings are to humble themselves before God, and both kings arrogantly resist. So Nebuchadnezzar is stricken with madness. He becomes like a beast in the field. But then he humbles himself before God, and his humanity returns to him. He's restored as king. This is in contrast with his son, Belshazzar, who doesn't humble himself before God, and he's assassinated that very night. Now, these 2 stories draw this imagery from Genesis chapters 1 and 2 and Psalm 8, where humans are depicted as the royal image of God. He's given them authority to rule over the beasts of the field and the birds of the air on behalf of God, who is the world's true king. But when human kingdoms forget that, when they rebel and make themselves and their power into a God, they become less than human, like violent beasts who will face God's justice. Which brings us to chapter 6, the pair of chapter 3. And this time it's Daniel who's being persecuted because he refuses to pray and worship the king as a god. And so, like the friends, he's sentenced to death and he's thrown into a lion's den. But God delivers him from the beasts, and like the friends, the king exalts Daniel and praises his God, which brings us to chapter 7. It's the pair of chapter 2 and the center of the book where all its themes come together. It's another dream, but it's Daniel's this time. And ironically, he can't understand the dream until an angelic messenger explains it to him. He sees a series of 4 beasts, one like a lion, then like a bear, then one like a winged leopard, each of these symbolizing an arrogant kingdom. And last of all is a super beast, identified as a really evil empire, and it has lots of horns, a common symbol for kings in the Old Testament, and there's one specific horn who is an image of an arrogant king who exalts himself above God and persecutes God's people. Now they are symbolized by a figure called the Son of Man, who's an image for both God's covenant people, but also for their king from the line of David. But then all of a sudden, God, who's called the Ancient of Days, comes and he sets up his throne. He destroys the super beast and he exalts the Son of Man on the clouds, where he comes up to sit at God's right hand and share in God's rule over the nations. We can look back now and see how all of these stories in the first half fit together. The three stories of faithfulness despite persecution, these are meant to offer hope to God's suffering people among the nations. But they suffer because human kingdoms have rebelled against God and have become beasts. And so these visions encourage patience, that God's people are to wait for him to bring his kingdom and rule over our world and vindicate his suffering people. But it raises the question about when God is going to do that, and that's what these final three visions set out to explore. In chapter 8, Daniel has another vision about the final two beasts of chapter 7, but this time they're symbolized by a ram, who we're told is the image of the empire of the Medes and Persians, and then by a goat, who's an image of ancient Greece. And out of the goat come a whole bunch of horns, one of which symbolizes the evil king from chapter 7. And we're told more about him, that he will attack Jerusalem and exalt himself above God and defile the temple with idols. However, in the end, he will be destroyed by God, who will exalt his people and his kingdom. Now, by chapter 9, Daniel is very puzzled, especially as to when all of this is going to take place. And so he consults the scroll of the prophet Jeremiah, where God said that Israel's exile would only last 70 years. So for Daniel, the 70 years is almost up. And so he asks God to fulfill his promise soon. But an angel comes and informs him that Israel's sin and rebellion has continued. And so their time of exile and oppression will continue on 7 times longer than Jeremiah envisioned. Daniel is deeply disturbed by this, and he has one final vision. We're shown the same sequence of kingdoms. It's Persia, then Greece, and Alexander the Great, followed by lesser kings, all leading up to this final king of the north, who will invade Jerusalem, set up idols in the temple, and exalt himself above God. But then, all of a sudden, this king comes to ruin. Now, there's been endless debate about what all of these visions refer to. Many see a clear connection to the exploits of the Syrian king Antiochus in the 160s BC. He killed many faithful Jews in Jerusalem and set up idols in the temple. Others think it points forward to the Roman Empire's role in the execution of Jesus and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. And still others think it will be fulfilled in future events that have yet to happen when Jesus will return. Now the problem is that the symbols and the numbers, they don't quite match any of these views perfectly. But it opens up the possibility that in a sense they are all right. The book of Daniel has been designed to offer hope to all future generations of God's people. It did so in the days of Antiochus' empire, and it has ever since. This is why Jesus could use imagery from Daniel to describe and confront the oppressive leaders he confronted in Jerusalem. This is why John, the visionary who wrote the Revelation, could adapt Daniel's visions and apply them to Rome of his day and also all future oppressive empires. And so the point of Daniel is that all generations of readers can find here a pattern and a promise. It's a pattern that human beings and their kingdoms become violent beasts when they glorify their own power, when they redefine right and wrong, and don't acknowledge God as their true king. But Daniel also holds out a promise that one day God will confront the beast. He will rescue his world and his people by bringing his kingdom over all nations. And so for every generation, this book speaks a message of hope that should motivate faithfulness. And that's what the book of Daniel is all about.
So hi, I'm Katie. I'm generally leading worship, and I was given permission to not stand in the corner this morning. So I'm here. I'm going to speak on Daniel. Really just like the Bible Project videos, we've been going through trying to get through the Bible in a year, and when you're going through a book at a time on Sunday, it's a nice starting point, I think. There's a lot of stories, a lot of weird dreams that we just heard about, so being able to kind of get us all on the same page, I think is really nice and helps set us up well this morning. I was excited to get asked to speak this morning on Daniel and on the Old Testament. As some of you know, I am a history teacher. I grew up in a family where we're like, yes, let's watch history documentaries and do trivia games for fun. So I was excited, but I understand that most people don't like going to history lecture, especially on Sundays. So I'm going to do my best this morning to only draw attention to those details that I believe are important for us to take into account in order to get to know God better. But with that being said, I'm not a Bible scholar. So this morning I'm just sharing what I believe God has shown me through the book of Daniel. So growing up in church and in Sunday school, I heard quite a bit actually about some of the stories that we heard in the video. So about Daniel and his friends rejecting the food, saying that, no, we don't want that. Heard about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being thrown into the fiery furnace. And about Daniel being thrown in the lion's den for continuing to pray to his God. Those stories come up a lot. It's generally like, oh, little kids, let's talk about throwing some guy into some lions and hoping he survived. Great for kids. And each time those stories were connected to the same message. Just stand up for what you believe in. Stand up for your faith. And that's a great message. But each of those stories in isolation are great examples of people sticking to their faith. So it'd be an appropriate message. But when looking at the larger picture, and as the book as a whole, there has to be more to the book of Daniel than that. Just looking in the video, seeing how some of those stories were paralleled to each other and how they connected. So like, how do Nebuchadnezzar turning into a near beast and Belshazzar seeing writing on the wall and then being assassinated factor into that idea of standing up for what you believe in? And what about the dreams of the horned animals and the statues crashing to the ground? It just doesn't sound like stand up for what you believe in. In my mind, there just has to be more to glean from the book as a whole. These stories and dreams are all interwoven together. They are written to work together to tell us something important. So today I'd actually like to look at the book as a whole rather than one specific story or dream to try to understand the larger picture better. But that means that we do have some history to get through, so I'll try to get through that. So at this point, the Israelites have been taken into captivity into Babylon, something we've heard about since Isaiah. So it's multiple books now that they're like, oh yeah, you're going to be taken to Babylon. And the Israelites are like, nah, not going to happen. But they are. They're taken from their homes, knowing their places of worship have been ransacked, stripped of its beauty, and destroyed. They feel abandoned, forsaken, and forgotten by the God of their ancestors. The king takes the Israelites of the best lineage and education in order to assimilate them to Babylonian life and serve in his court. And this is where we're introduced to the four main Israelites, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They were said in chapter 1 of the book, verses 3 and 4, to be of the royal family and nobility. They were young men without physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. Sounds like these men have their life together. However, for these men, their identity was being stripped away. They were taken from their home and place of worship, taught new customs, and are being assimilated into a new way of life. Even their names were changed, and names were of extreme significance in biblical times. There are multiple accounts of God and Jesus purposely changing people's names to reflect their role, their character, or their position in relation to God. Names were not identifiers as much as we use them for today, but they were descriptors. Daniel, whose name meant God is my judge, had his name changed to Belshazzar, meaning protect the life of the king. So again, changing his purpose to being judged by God to protecting the life of the king. Hananiah, whose name meant gift of the Lord, had his name changed to Shadrach, which meant command of the god of the moon, whose name was Aku. Mishael, whose name meant God, who is like God, had his name changed to Meshach, which means who is as Aku is, so again the god of the moon. And Azariah, whose name meant Yah has helped, had his name changed to Abednego, which meant servant of Nebu, the Babylonian god of wisdom. So their names, who they were meant to be, was completely changed. Babylon was trying to take the Israelite out of them, and looking at that, it's not a shock. No wonder they would want to protest. But wait a minute. Let's reevaluate. These four men aren't said to actually have stood up to protest their Babylonian education, right? Later in the book, Daniel is still referred to as Daniel. If you read through, they'll be like, oh, let's call Daniel. But personally, I think this is more from the people recognizing his Israelite identity because he was calling on his Israelite God to interpret dreams. Not Daniel saying, nope, call me Daniel, otherwise I'm not coming over. It's like he wasn't protesting the name change. It it would appear that the education and the names were fine to Daniel and the others. So it doesn't mean that they liked them. They weren't like, yes, I didn't like my name anyway. But they didn't fight against them. To be honest, this confused me for a little bit because, again, there were people who stood up to protect their Israelite identity. But why weren't these things as important? Why weren't these things worth putting their lives on the line for? But then I realized these aspects of their identity were man-made, right? God had never said not to learn about other cultures, just not to get sucked up in the idolatry of other people. He never said his people couldn't have Babylonian names. God hadn't named Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, or Azariah. People did. So while their identity and pieces of themselves that made them Israelite were under attack, these four men only took a stand when their God-established identities were being threatened. And this is something that we should take to heart and do ourselves. I would argue that one of the big ideas in Daniel focuses on our identities. So with that, we're actually going to take a deeper look into those three main stories that I mentioned earlier to really figure out what those God-established identities are, starting with the defiled food. So when these men were first taken into the custody of the king, the four men were given meat and wine from the king's table to ensure that they were healthy and strong. The king's like, I don't want any wimps serving in my court. I need to make sure that you guys are prepared, that you've trained to work with me. So they got stuff from his table. Okay? The men asked instead to have vegetables and water so that they would not be defiled by the food. Growing up, I had been told that the food might have been sacrificed to Babylonian gods, so that it was unfit for the men to eat. However, upon further research that I've just done on my own, it would seem that the more likely issue was that the food prepared for the men did not reach or fall within their God-established dietary restrictions. Some historians argue that they were probably served meat from hoofed animals, and that the wine contained blood within it, something that would have been somewhat common during Babylonian times. And both of these things were forbidden for the people of Israel to eat. Okay? Now, food itself cannot defile you. Jesus himself said in Mark chapter 7 that food does not defile. After Jesus' sacrifice, the food restrictions were removed, not because the animals were suddenly cleaned by Jesus' crucifixion, but because of what the food restrictions were supposed to do. The restrictions set the Israelites apart and reminded them that God is their provider. God will provide their food and their strength, and they shouldn't eat foods that he considered unclean in order to live. God wanted his people to rely on him for sustainment and rely on him for their needs. So it would make sense that those restrictions were removed once Jesus died and rose again, the ultimate proof of God's provision. Here, God establishes himself as caretaker and provider. So first identity, God is caretaker and provider. I'm actually going to read the second story we're going to go through together, so if you would like to follow along with me, I'm going to be in Daniel chapter 6. Verses 3 through 23, I'm reading out of the NIV, so if you're not reading the NIV, our words are going to be a little different. So chapter 6, starting in verse 3. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." Now these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever! The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed." So King Darius put the decree in writing. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room, where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish the decree that during the next 30 days anyone who prays to any god or human being except you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands, in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, May your God whom you serve continually rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, May the king live forever. May my God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den, and when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. So here in this story we learn that God wanted his people to continue to pray to him. In Deuteronomy 11:13, it says that his people are called to serve him with all their heart, with all their heart and all their soul. While this isn't God directly commanding his people to pray to him, the Jewish people believed that prayer was service of the heart. So saying to serve him with all your heart meant prayer. In other words, if you were seeking to serve God with all your heart, you would want to communicate with him, be on the same page, and grow closer to him. This is why Daniel refused to cease his normal prayer routine even under threat of the lion's den. He knew that his God desired a relationship with him, and he honored that. King Darius even took note of Daniel's service to God, telling him in verse 16, May your God whom you serve continuously rescue you. Daniel continued to pray 3 times a day despite the law of the land, devoting that time to his Lord and Master. But what I found interesting from this passage is that Daniel still recognizes his service to King Darius, right? In verse 22, Daniel exclaims that God saved him because Daniel was found blameless before God and before Darius. Daniel's ignoring the law and continuing to pray doesn't prove that Daniel sought to disregard Babylonian law, right? In fact, the beginning of the passage that I just read says the complete opposite. Daniel had moved up in the ranks of court because of his service and devotion to his king. He had done so well that the people resorted to making a decree about his prayer and not about his service to the king. Right? They weren't just like, oh, let's find some shoddy bookwork or something that he did wrong. They had to say, oh, that he's going to pray, let's trap him there. Daniel refusing to cease his prayer only emphasizes the importance of his devotion to his heavenly Lord and Master. King Darius may have commanded him to stop, but it was far more important to Daniel that God, his Lord and Master, had commanded him to pray. If Daniel had served so faithfully to King Darius, why would we expect any less devotion to the King of the universe? So from these 2 stories, we've seen God establish himself as provider and as Master and Lord, 2 separate identities. Now you might be a little confused because I said that we were going to talk about the men's identity, and all I've talked about is God's identity. Thank you for bearing with me. I was purposeful in this. I truly believe that God establishes our identity when he establishes his identity, because he establishes his identity in relationship to us. You don't go up to random people on the street and call them Father. If you do that, we might need to have another conversation. You only do that if that's your relationship to them, right? If you are their son or daughter. If he calls himself a provider, that means he's in relationship with people who need provision, right? The Israelites. If he calls himself master and lord, that means he has authority over and is in relationship with people who serve him, us. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego all refused to worship another idol, even though they knew that they would be thrown into a fiery furnace and possibly incinerated, because that's the ultimate betrayal of God, attributing his authority and power to another person, right? Saying, we don't want that relationship with you, right? Idol worship is the rejection and misattribution of the relationships that God eventually gave up his Son to protect. God hates having broken relationships with us, which is why Jesus was sent in the first place. God gave up of himself in order to protect our relationship with him. He sent Jesus to cement that with us as provider, as Lord, and as Father. So where exactly does that leave the incidences with Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar? Remember? So Nebuchadnezzar being like, oh yeah, I'm so cool. And then God's like, nope, you're going to live like an animal for a long time. And Belshazzar seeing writing on the wall, God said, hey, don't be proud. And he's like, I'm going to be proud, and then was killed. Great. Both men were proud and laid claim to the power that allowed the Babylonian Empire to grow, right? They're like, we're the reason Babylon is so mighty. They took credit for God's authority. And remember that God said all the way back in Isaiah that he would have Babylon be victorious, right? He was going to not only let Babylon do what it wanted, but he was actually going to give them the power to do that. He empowered them. God saw that he needed to remind them that even though the Israelites weren't in Israel, God still had power and authority. After all, God is a God of the nations, right? And has his hands in everything. No king would be able to overcome him and his might. Nebuchadnezzar was humbled after being turned into an animalistic form, right? That's a big display. Like, everyone's going to notice if your king is suddenly crawling around and eating grass. But I believe that demonstration was more meant for the people of Israel than it was really meant for Nebuchadnezzar. They needed to be reminded that although Babylon was working to strip them of their past and their identity, that no one is more powerful than God. Which kind of leads us into the visions and ultimately is kind of like the high point of the book, like everything's leading to those visions at the end. There is a debate whether or not the visions represent the end of the Babylonian Empire, the coming of Christ, or the end times, like the end of the end. And I'm not an expert and would prefer to leave that debate for another time. And in the case of the message of the overall book of Daniel, we can make do today without that debate. In the different visions that occur, whether it's a statue being crushed or horned beasts being destroyed, God is reminding his people of two things. The first being that God is powerful, right? Because he shows these really powerful figures and then destroys them. He's powerful. And that God outlasts the kingdoms and authorities of this world. The kingdoms of this world fall apart like statues hit by boulders, but his kingdom lasts forever, overcoming the harshest of rivals. God is victorious, and he desires for us to be alongside him. We are to have hope in him, and that he will redeem our broken relationship with him. So to kind of wrap that all up together, we are to stand up to defend our God-established identities by maintaining our relationship with him. The 4 Israelites were unwavering in their dedication to acknowledge God as their provider, their master, and their king above all kings. God continued during that time to remind his people that he has the power to outlast the kingdoms of this world, and who better for us to establish and maintain a relationship with. But where exactly does that leave us this morning, and how exactly do we maintain a relationship with God? There are 3 things I'd like to leave us with to think on over the course of this next week. So the first thing that I think we need to do is acknowledge the relationship, but in the right reasons, or for the right reasons, in the right way. When I think about how we as Christians acknowledge our relationship with God, I automatically think of our traditions, our customs, our Christian habits, right? This could be celebrating Easter or Christmas, taking communion on Sundays, going to church every week, going to a Bible study. Those are all ways that we say, hey, we're Christian, this is what we do. But sometimes I wonder if we just kind of do that because it's something we've always done, right? Sometimes we need a reminder that we don't keep these traditions for the sake of traditions, but because they remind us of the sacrifice God gave in order to establish a relationship with us. Remember that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego weren't like, hey, we're not going to eat meat because we just don't eat meat. Why would they risk death for that? Or they're not, oh, we're not going to sit here and bow down to this idol just because that's just not what we've done. We've actually heard that Israelites over the past have grown to be used to worshiping idols, which is why they're in Babylon now. It was punishment for that. We go to church and Bible study not because they look good or that's the Christian thing to do, but because we can grow in community with each other and get to know more about God. We worship Him with music, not just because we like to perform, but because He is deserving of glory and recognition. We celebrate holidays like Christmas and Easter because the gift of Jesus is too amazing not to celebrate. We are called to have an answer ready when people ask about our faith. Are we ready to explain our traditions and our lifestyle to others, or do we just say that it's the Christian thing to do? So first, we're called to acknowledge the relationship and for the right reasons, having an explanation for why we go to church and Bible study and do all these things. Second, we are called to live lives that are set apart even when not surrounded by Christian community. How are we doing that? Are we doing that? When Daniel prayed, it said that he did so as he had always done. So just because the law had changed and said he shouldn't pray didn't mean that he stopped. He didn't change how he lived even when the world around him did. Our Christian identity doesn't just live within this building. It goes wherever we go. That would be like saying and acting like you have a father when you're home with him, but then living the rest of your life like you have no father. It just doesn't make sense. So are we living in a way that shows that we have a heavenly Father, even when we're not surrounded by other Christians? One way that I've seen this in my own life, I guess I realized over the course of this year that I was so much more comfortable with talking about certain aspects of my life, but wouldn't bring up the fact that I was a Christian when just talking to people. I'd be like, oh yeah, I play basketball, I play this instrument, I do that, but would never bring up my faith. So when I was student teaching this past fall, and at one point I was like, you know what, church is a part of my life, like it's a part of what I do, why don't I talk about that when they ask me what I do on my weekends? So I started having conversations with my cooperating teacher. We'd be like, oh yeah, so what are you doing this week? And be like, oh yeah, I lead worship at a church, so I have all that. And it led to conversations of, oh, well, what do you look for in a church? He hadn't been to church in a while. That started great conversations, which led to others like, what do I think is valuable in a faith, or even talking about love languages, or talking about how to care for kids, and then eventually turned into something that, even though I wasn't teaching about Christianity in the class that I was doing world history, so I'd actually had to teach about like Buddhism and Taoism and stuff like that, but not Christianity. But at the end of my semester there, when he was writing a report for my university supervisor, he acknowledged that I had a deep care for kids that he believed was connected to my religious beliefs, and he wrote that in. And that was a surprise to me, because again, like, I never was like, I care for you because I'm a Christian. Like, that was just never exactly the conversation that we did, but he brought up multiple times that he believed that my deep care for children as people came from those religious beliefs. So we're acknowledging a relationship for the right reasons. We're called to continue to live lives that are set apart even when not surrounded by Christian community. And one of the harder things, the last thing I'm going to leave with us today, is that we recognize the authority of the God we gave our life to. With Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, they didn't, right? They severed that acknowledgement. Where are we stripping God of his authority and claiming responsibility for his success? I think this is where we largely do that, right? The Babylonian kings took credit for turning Babylon into a great empire. That was power and success given by God, yet they claimed it as their own. So where in our own lives are we like, yeah, I have a great job, I finally bought a house, like I have a great family, my kids are doing great, and where are we taking credit for that, right? And where are we saying, hey, I just got this new job, I see that God really lined that up, like this is the right time. Or, oh, this is how God helped these pieces fall into place. There are times where when things get really exciting and things are going well, we take that credit on ourselves rather than acknowledging God and his success. God gave up his son for us. He went that extra mile to be back with us, but where are we then cutting him off, saying, no, we did this on our own, and not letting him in? Again, just if you get anything from the book of Daniel, even in times of exile or even in times where we feel far away like the Israelites did, God still is purposeful in helping us understand that he's protecting those relationships with us, that he desires to be with us. But sometimes we're cutting him off and not letting him in, or doing things for the wrong reason.